Hello and welcome back to LearnLinuxTV. In today's video, what I'm going to do is go over my top 5 favorite terminal emulators for the Linux desktop, and actually a few of them are cross-platform as well, so even you Mac and Windows users out there will be happy with some of the selections on my list. But I wanted to give you guys a list of my favorite terminal emulators because, well, it's something that I get asked every now and then. Which terminal emulator should I use? And I have 5 of them in this video for you to consider. Now, this is not an extensive list of all the terminal emulators that are available for the Linux desktop. I mean, obviously, there's more than 5. There's all kinds of different terminal emulators available, but these are my 5 personal favorite terminal emulators that I recommend that you consider. Now, I made sure to not include any terminal emulator on this list that constitutes a default terminal emulator for a desktop. For example, the Mate terminal, GNOME terminal, console, and so on. I made sure not to include those. You've probably already used one of those terminals anyway. I wanted to focus on the optional terminals that you can install, so that's what I'm going to do in this video. Now, before I get into that though, I want to take a moment to mention the sponsor for today's video, Linode. And Linode has been a sponsor of LearnLinuxTV for quite some time now, and that makes sense. This is a Linux YouTube channel, and Linode is a cloud server provider that specializes in Linux, and they have all kinds of distributions available there. So you could get your very own Linux server set up and ready to go in minutes, and you could get that server for as low as $5 a month, and the pricing is very straightforward. You could spin up a Linux server to start your very own blog, maybe your very own Nextcloud server, or maybe you can use Linode to spin up your very own test server that you can use while you're going over any of the tutorial videos that are available on LearnLinuxTV. They have all kinds of really cool features such as Kubernetes, block storage, object storage, DNS, and so on. The feature set is amazing, the dashboard is very easy to use, and I highly recommend that you check them out to get your very own account. And by using the URL that you see on the screen right now, you can start your very own account with $100 in free credit that's good for up to 60 days, and there's all kinds of Linux that you could fit within that credit. Definitely check out Linode, and I really appreciate their continued sponsorship of LearnLinuxTV. Now let's go ahead and dive into my list of my top 5 terminal emulators. And let's start with number 1. And these are not in order of preference, by the way, but the first one that I'm going to start with is Tilix. And I already have it installed. In fact, I've installed all of these already on my laptop, so I'll bring it up right now. And here's Tilix in all its glory. So at first it might not look like much, but I promise you this one is really cool. You'll notice that we have several buttons up here at the top of the window. And when I click on some of these buttons, you'll see immediately why I like it so much. So for example, I just created a horizontal split right here. I could also do the same with a vertical split, and I could resize them as well, but that's not all. Up here, we have a list of sessions, and of course we start with 1. But if I click the plus icon here, I'm going to get additional terminals that share the same window. And I can switch between them by selecting them right from the dropdown. So for example, maybe right here I have htop running, and there it is. And I'll switch over here to the first terminal, and maybe I have a job running or some kind of task that I'm working on in this terminal. And then, whenever I want to switch over to htop, I have it running right here. That's pretty cool. So as you can see, we can switch through the different sessions. We can create splits. We can resize them. And we can also close them as well. So we have a lot of flexibility here with Tilix. And we also have some keyboard shortcuts as well. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and just kill these other terminals here. Now we're down to 1, and I'll get rid of this one as well. So some of the keyboard shortcuts that I would like to share with you for Tilix, if this is something that you want to check out, you could do Control-Shift-T, and that actually creates another terminal. Notice right here that we have another terminal in the list. So if I hold Control and Shift to press T again, I have 3, and now I have a bunch. I have 7 terminals open, and I can open them with that keyboard shortcut. Now, what if I want a new window altogether? I can get a brand new window by holding Shift and Control, which is actually the case for most of these shortcuts. and then I could do N for new, and I have a new window to work with. Now, as cool as it is to open up a new window, the main benefit of Tilix is that you have all of your windows underneath this menu right here on the left-hand side, which is just so cool. Now, speaking of different terminals, you can also switch between the terminals that are shown right here in this menu with a keyboard shortcut as well. And I like this because I don't like to use the mouse unless I absolutely have to. We can hold Control and press page up to go up. And notice on the top left, the number increases and decreases. So I hold Control, press page down, and page up. So for example, I have htop running right here. I don't know why I keep using that as an example, but I do. And then I hold Control and press page down. I go to terminal number 2, and then I hold Control and press page up to go back to the first terminal. Now Control-Alt-R, that gives me a vertical split, and then Control-Alt-D gives me a horizontal split in that same window. So technically that's adding a new terminal down, so D is down, Control-Alt down, and then Control-Alt-R is new terminal right. So for example, if I hold Control and Alt and press R right here, I get a new terminal on the right-hand side of where I'm at. Now if I move my cursor all the way over here to the first one, and then I do Control-Alt-R, notice that my new terminal shows up right here. So when you hold Control and Alt and press R, you're getting a new terminal to the right of where you currently are, where your cursor is blinking, that's where you are. So that'll help you determine where the terminal is going to end up when you hold Control Alt and press R or D to get a new split. But to move between the splits, you can simply click on one, and notice how we have an outline of a cursor in an inactive window, and then in an active window, the cursor is blinking. It doesn't always blink, or it blinks for a little bit and then it stops. But we do have a full cursor right here. It's not an outline. That's how we know which terminal we're actually inside of. And then to switch between them without using the mouse, I could hold Alt and then press any of the arrow keys. So for example, left, right, down, up, left, right, down. You get the idea. If you hold down Shift and Alt and then press an arrow key, you actually start changing the size of the individual split. That's pretty cool. So it's pretty cool that you could resize these splits without reaching for your mouse. In fact, there's all kinds of keyboard shortcuts here that I can't go over in one video, but what you could do is actually view all of the keyboard shortcuts. And this wasn't actually set up by default, but I added this keyboard shortcut myself, Control, Super, and then V. And we get this really awesome window right here that gives us a list of the common keyboard shortcuts in Tilix. Now, what I did to actually get that list is I customized this. So I went over here, and then I went to Preferences. We have Shortcuts right here. And then we have View Configured Shortcuts, and I set that to Control, Super, V. On your end, you can set that to whatever you'd like. Some distributions might already have a keyboard shortcut that's using that, so you may or may not want to use the same keyboard shortcut as I'm using. But the point is, you could go ahead and set a keyboard shortcut that gives you a list of all the other keyboard shortcuts, which will definitely help you remember it. Now, Tilix, as you can see, is pretty awesome, but there's some downsides as well. I want to make sure that I give you guys the pros and the cons of each inside this video. And one of the cons of Tilix is that it's actually kind of heavyweight. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not going to saturate your RAM. It's not Google Chrome or anything like that, but it is going to be a heavier terminal than most. So I would recommend Tilix for people that either have a lot of RAM, or maybe you're using a desktop environment like GNOME or something like that, maybe even Cinnamon. I feel like this terminal will fit in quite well in those desktop environments, especially because GNOME, for example, they already have header bars here in the title bar, so it fits right in. Now, if you're more of a fan of lighter weight terminals, I have some other selections in this list that'll cater to you guys, but Tilix is just not going to be a good fit for someone that wants something small and light. So let's go ahead and close out of here, and we'll check out my next selection, which is actually going to be similar to Tilix, but it's going to be lighter when it comes to resource usage. And the next one on my list is going to be Terminator. And here it is in all its glory. This is Terminator. Now, it might look a little strange at first if you haven't seen it before, but it's actually a really cool terminal emulator with a lot of customization options. Now, I mentioned that Terminator is actually similar to Tilix, but what exactly did I mean by that? Well, one of the similarities between Tilix and Terminator is the fact that you can have horizontal and vertical splits. And this is just one of those things that I think is just so cool. So I'll make this bigger and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So what I could do is right click anywhere in this terminal window here, and I could split horizontally. I could split vertically, as you can see. And then I could click on each individual pane to move my cursor into that pane. So now I'm right here, and now I'm right here. And also, like Tilix, you can hold Alt and then press an arrow key, and that'll help you switch to the currently active pane. Notice that the red title bar follows the cursor, so in one way it's a little bit easier to tell which one currently has focus because you have that red bar that just, well, totally stands out. And we can also resize a pane with the keyboard as well. So if you hold Shift and Control, and while you're holding those down, you press an arrow key, you can see that I'm actually able to resize the individual panes. So I can make one larger than another, and that'll help me make better use of my screen real estate. And we can also customize Terminator as well. So if I right click anywhere here, and then go down to Preferences, as you can see here, we can go to Profiles, we could change the font, we could change the colors. So we have all kinds of different options here for how to customize Terminator. And you know what? Terminator is just plain awesome. This is probably the terminal emulator that I use the most, but I do like all of the ones on this list. Now, as far as downsides, Terminator doesn't really have many downsides. I mean, one downside potentially is that it's not the most lightweight terminal emulator on this list, but it's not going to be as heavy as Tilix. And don't get me wrong, like I mentioned, Tilix isn't Google Chrome. It's not going to saturate your RAM, but you know, some people really love lightweight and tiny terminal emulators. And while Terminator is definitely smaller than Tilix, it's not the smallest on this list. So what I'm going to do is just close out of this, and we'll check out the next selection on my list. Now the next terminal emulator, number 3 in my list, is Alacritty, and I really hope I'm saying that right. I'm not 100% sure, but what I'll do is I'll bring it up, and I will show you. Now at first it might not look like much. I mean, nothing happens when I right click here. I have this very small window, so this is really simple. But what exactly sets Alacritty apart from other terminal emulators? So one of the benefits of Alacritty is that it's actually GPU accelerated, which should make it a lot smoother than other terminal emulators. But that's not even the coolest part in my opinion. What I really like about this terminal emulator, besides the fact that it's smooth and it works well, is that it's cross-platform. Now here I am on a Pop! OS installation. That's what I'm running here on my laptop, but you can also run this on your Mac if you happen to have one, as well as your Windows PC if you have that. Now what I'm going to do is just make this a little bit bigger, and I will show you how to customize this because earlier I mentioned there's no right-click menu. So how exactly do you customize this particular terminal? Well, if I go into my .config folder, and then I have an Alacritty folder inside there, you'll notice that I have this config file right here that I've renamed with a .bak extension. But this is actually the config file that we want to edit right here. So what I'm going to do is just move this over to the original name. So now that I've named that file properly, if I reopen the terminal, we can see that my window is bigger. That was one of the settings that I've changed. I've customized the font size as well. I also added a bit of transparency. So if I open a file manager window, and then I'll just go ahead and move this terminal above it, you can kind of see the application behind the window through the window because you could customize transparency as well. In fact, every terminal emulator on my list does indeed give you the ability to customize transparency in some form or fashion. So this feature isn't unique to Alacritty. It's just something that I like to do. And I was able to do that by customizing the config file that I have saved in my .config folder inside Alacritty. And again, there it is. If I open it up, you can see that we have all the customization here. Almost everything is commented out, but it's just giving you some examples of some of the things that you can customize. And as you can see, there's a lot of things here that you can customize. So I really like that a lot. And also, I really like the fact that it uses a YAML file for configuration. And this makes it very easy to create a config file that you like, save it, and then you could copy that config file to all of your computers so that Alacritty will behave the exact same way on each machine. Personally, I find it easier to customize a config file than a GUI config editor, because again, it makes it a lot easier to grab the config file and then drop it on whatever machine you want to have the same config. It's just my preferred way to do it. But the thing is though, this config file doesn't actually exist by default, and it's not going to be created when you open this terminal for the very first time. So to grab the default config file, what you do is you just open up a browser. And I'll have a link to this down in the description below this video. But what you want to do is navigate to github.com and then /Alacritty, and then /Alacritty again. And that brings you to the default GitHub page for this project, which is really cool. I mean, it's open source. That's awesome. But if you scroll down and then you click on the GitHub releases page, you'll have a list of releases here that you can download from. So I guess if you're curious, how do I install this? Well, that's one way you can do it. But specifically what I want to draw your attention to is the presence of the Alacritty YAML file right here. So it's a good idea to grab the config file here from the releases page, because if it ever changes in the future with a newer version of this emulator, you could grab a matching YAML file. So that way you could take advantage of any new features they might have added. And it's going to download it. So you save it. And then what you do after you save the file is you create the Alacritty folder underneath .config. You drop it in there. And then you open it up in a text editor. And you go ahead and customize it. You can see some of the customizations that I've made right here. So under the Windows section, I had to uncomment that. And then I went ahead and added these values to determine the starting window size. So that'll actually determine how big the initial window is before I do anything at all. So if I bring it back up again, and that's actually overly large. So that's actually not as big as I want it. But anyway, my point is you could go ahead and customize it here. Alacritty is really awesome. I recommend you check it out. We have the config file right here. So if you want to play around with that, you can do so. You know, for example, adding transparency, you get the idea. And then save this config file somewhere, and then you have a master config file that you can use to get your defaults back. I think that's awesome. Now, the main downside for Alacritty is that although it's really awesome, I mean, you may or may not want to customize a config file like I'm doing right here. I mean, even though I like it personally, not everyone is going to prefer that in particular. Maybe you actually prefer a GUI config editor. There's nothing wrong with that. But this could be a little annoying sometimes because you have to have the spacing just right. It is a YAML file after all. And if you don't have everything spaced correctly, then it's just not going to read anything at all whatsoever. So it does require a bit of customization and spending some time on tweaking things. But if you don't mind that, then Alacritty is actually really cool. So the next one on my list is actually called Kitty. This is it right here. That's the actual name. And as you can see, the default customization here in my case, I mean, the text is very small. I could barely read that, but it's very easy to change the customization. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, like Alacritty, Kitty is actually GPU accelerated as well. So if that's a feature that you really want to take advantage of, then you have two options within my list. Now, Alacritty and Kitty are actually kind of rivals. I don't really prefer one over the other because they're both awesome, and there's all kinds of debate out there about which one is superior. I recommend you check out both and then make a decision for yourself. But one thing I definitely like about this is that you can open the config file right from the terminal itself without having to manually find the file and edit it. So for example, Control Shift and then F2, that brings up the config file. Now already, we see that the font size is teensy, so you're not going to be able to see this. So we need to fix that font size. Let's see how we can do that. So what I'll do is search for the word font, and it's really cool that it supports Vim shortcuts, so muscle memory works for me right here. And I'm going to search for every occurrence. Where is the font size? And here it is right here. So let's go ahead and bump this up. Just going to make it ridiculous. I will change it to, I don't know, 24. That's probably going to make it huge, but that's what I'll set it to. So I'll save it just like we do in Vim, :W enter, then :Q to quit out. So what I'm going to do is just exit out, bring it back up, and we have a larger font size. So I guess a font size of 24 wasn't as big as I thought it was going to be. This is a high DPI laptop, so obviously all the font sizes are going to be small by default, but you get the idea. I was able to customize the font size, and that worked out well for me. Now, in this case, we also have the config file over here in the .config directory, and then we go into the Kitty folder. Inside there, I have kitty.conf.back. That's the one that I was playing around with before I started recording. So what I'll do is just move that over to the original name to replace that file. So now we only have that one. So I'll bring it back up. And here we have my custom configuration for Kitty. You may or may not be able to see the fact that I have transparency enabled, so I'll just open up a file manager window yet again. And you can see that we have some awesome transparency here that is just so cool. And I was able to customize this by just simply editing that config file, changing a couple of the values, and I'm good to go. But that's not the only thing that I like about Kitty. We also have some additional features as well that are really cool. Let's go ahead and check it out. Now, if I hold Control and Shift and press Enter, check this out. I get a horizontal split like you see right here. Control Shift T, that gives me a new tab. We can see the tabs actually show up down here, and they look kind of cool actually. Look at this. I mean, this is a very unique way to show tabs. So that's really cool. Let's go ahead and close these. I'm just going to hold Control and press D to get out of those, and I'll open up a few new splits. So as you can see, I have 4 splits right here. Now another thing that we could do in this terminal emulator is we can hold Shift and Control and then press L. And when we do that, the layout mode actually changes into one of several variations. So in this case, I'm actually zoomed into one terminal in particular, and it'll probably become more apparent if I run something like htop in this window, so that way you can see kind of how it moves around. So now it's full screen, Control Shift L, and I'm going to keep pressing it. And then you can see the different layouts that are available. So as you can see, Kitty is very awesome, and I highly recommend that you check it out. As far as downsides are concerned, I think that the customization can be daunting to someone who really doesn't want to spend a lot of time customizing the terminal. But in addition to that, I really don't like the way that it handles splits. I think that Terminator and Tilix really have that nailed down. But here we have the ability to open a new terminal, and depending on which layout you're in, that determines how that particular new terminal is laid out on the screen. And then you switch with Control, Shift, and L like I mentioned. And that might be okay for some of you, but that's really the only downside for me. Now don't get me wrong, there's all kinds of customization options when it comes to Kitty. So of course you could go ahead and change the configuration and change the way that this terminal behaves, and that'll help you make it your own. But as long as you don't mind spending some time tweaking this and customizing it, I think Kitty is awesome. Now the last one on my list is perhaps the lightest weight of all of them, and that is rxvt-unicode. And when I say tiny, this one is very tiny. So I'll go ahead and launch it. And when I say tiny, I wasn't kidding, was I? This window is minuscule, and the font is so small I can't even read it. So already, it really doesn't look like rxvt-unicode is any good at all, because if you can't read it, well, how useful could it be? But don't let that fool you. Once you customize rxvt and make it your own, it definitely looks a lot better than it does right now. So what I'm going to do is open another terminal because this one is so small I can't even see what the heck I'm doing. So what I'll do is just open up Tilix yet again. And I'll close this out right here. I have a hidden file right here called xresources.old. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to overwrite the xresources file itself. And then what I'll do is type xrdb. I want to reload the configuration for the xresources file. So I'll just go ahead and tell it to find the file, and there it is. So I'll exit this, and let's go ahead and open up rxvt yet again and see how different it looked from the first time I opened it up. And check it out, it definitely looks a lot better than it did before, in my opinion. And like I mentioned, rxvt is a very lightweight terminal, so if you want to make sure you get your RAM usage as low as you possibly can, and it kind of makes sense, I mean, why should your terminal use up all of your RAM? Your browser is bad enough, then rxvt is a great fit. But the configuration can be a little bit daunting and perhaps more complicated than anything else that I've mentioned on this list, because you have to know how to edit an xresources file in order to make this look sane. In my opinion, and also as you just saw, the default configuration is practically unusable. Even on a 1080p screen, that's going to be way too small to read, so you'll definitely need to customize this in order to use it on a regular basis. And again, you do that by editing the .xresources file. And we have mine right here. I only have 5 lines in this particular file. And the lines that I have here actually control the window geometry, how big the window is, the font size. I like to hide the scroll bar by default. I made the background black and the foreground white, as you can see. But there's all kinds of different options that you can configure. I think the best way to do this is to look at other people's configs. I mean, you can look at them in GitHub, you can Google this, and you can find individual lines that you might want to add to this file that'll help you make it your own. So if you don't mind spending some time learning the customization and copying and pasting values into this file and testing it out, then rxvt-unicode is really awesome. Like I mentioned, it's lightweight, and since we have a config file that we can edit, we could drop that config file on any of our other machines, and, well, you're going to get the same config. So if you're a fan of lightweight terminal emulators, then rxvt-unicode is definitely the way to go. So there you have it. Let me know in the comments down below if I missed anything, like a really awesome terminal emulator that should have been on my list. And maybe you guys will let me know about something awesome that I didn't even know about. So put your comments down there in the comments section. I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so. I have some awesome content coming very soon. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching.